But this question of fear, we're all afraid of it. And there are things in relationship to this fear that you and I have to recognize. That if you trust in God and let Him be your guide and strength, you won't have that fear. And your fear is in relationship to your trust. As your faith in God gets stronger, your fear dissipates. And as your faith in God gets weaker, your fear arises. You want to have fear dissipated and removed, then you rise up and hold up the name of the living God and look to Him to undertake for you, and He will. It's our faith that brings victory. It's our faith that casts out fear and enables us to put our trust in the blessed Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. We will worship the man of Galilee who went to a cross 2,000 years ago, and no one can take His place. No one will intercede or interfere. We will not permit it. So it is we have faith without fear.
Lord sing praise again. We were the beggars, now we're royalty. We were the prisoners, now we're running free. We are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by His grace. Let the house of the Lord sing praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today. And we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place. And we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. We shout out your praise.
Well, good morning, everybody. Pastor Mark with you here on the River Church, Franklin Park Online. Thanks for joining me. Welcome to my house. Welcome to our family room downstairs. That's where we're recording some of today's messages. Thanks for joining me. Hey, do me a favor, like this, subscribe to it, whatever's appropriate for whatever social media platform you're watching this on. Make sure you do that. Share it with somebody. It could be a message, I think, today that we're talking about that a lot of people could really relate to. So make sure you do this. Hey, it's been kind of a crazy week here in Pittsburgh, and I think the picture I'm about to show you kind of is going to be the picture of the year. It kind of sums up a pretty crazy week. We had a bridge collapse recently here in Pittsburgh. So look at this picture. This is them removing the bus flying through the sky out of the collapsed bridge area. The great thing was nobody was seriously injured. It's a miracle. Nobody was killed or seriously injured. And this picture right here is probably going to end up being the picture of the year, I bet, somewhere, maybe the front cover of something. But, you know, on Facebook, I posted this a couple days ago, and I have very witty friends. And somebody commented on my Facebook, said, do you need a CDL license or a pilot's license to be on this bus? So it was a great comment. I thought it was really funny, and it just kind of captured some of the humor, tried to make a little bit of humor out of what could have been a tragedy. That picture that you're looking at, it shows collapse. It shows danger. But when you also look at this picture, you also see a picture of rescue, and you're reminded that people were rescued out of that. And for me, when I looked at it, it's a picture of resurrection. This bus coming out of the pit to have new life again. And today's message is not about a bus, but it's about a boat. It involves a boat. It's about failure, and it's about faith, and it's about fear. And we're going to dive into this here in the moment. And it's not just a story about a boat, but it's really the story about the one who is in our boat with us, in the boat of our life with us. This is week 5 of our series called Questions from God, exploring these questions that God asks us. I know we all have questions for God, but in this series, we're really looking at the questions that God asks us. And today, and for the next 3 weeks after this, we shift into the questions that Jesus asked us in the New Testament, or at least a few of them. So I want to take you to our passage today. It happens in the book of Mark, chapter 4, and starting at verse 35. And here's what it says. That day when evening came, and just so you know the context, Jesus has been teaching on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. And by the way, that's really a lake, and it's about 8 miles wide. That's going to be important here in a moment. And so he's teaching on the western side all day. And then it says in verse 35, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Again, about an 8-mile journey. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him, and so there's some other boats that kind of follow. It says, a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. By the way, the Sea of Galilee is famous, still to this day, for quick storms that can jump up and literally have waves 8 to 10 feet crashing over the boat. And so it says it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? And so you can see the picture here of Jesus asleep in the back of the boat, and these guys are fearful for their life. Waves are crashing. They're in a huge storm. And in this passage, we see a couple things. We see an invitation. So Jesus invites them to go across to the other side of the lake. By the way, that's a place that they hardly ever went to because there were Gentiles on the other side of the lake, and the Jewish people did not mix with the Gentiles, or at least as little as they had to. There's an invitation. There's a journey. There's a storm. There's a question. There's fear. There's an action that happens that we're about to see, and there's another question that comes in a moment. But in this story, we start with some shock, right? There's some shock in this. It says, look, the disciples are like, look, you asked me to go across to the other side of the lake. You asked Jesus, I followed. Okay, I did what you asked. You asked me to go across the other side of the lake. I did it. I followed. And there's some shock then. You're like, how can this happen? How can we be doing what you want us to do, Jesus? And now we're in this predicament. How could this happen? And maybe you felt that way, like, hey, somebody told me that if I followed Jesus, that all would be great all the time. And someone told you that, and now you find yourself in the midst of a storm, and there is shock. You're shocked that this is happening. And then that's quickly followed by fear. Fear. And let's be honest, in this passage, there is something to be afraid of. There's real danger here. This is real danger. The lake was known to swallow up people, boats, all the time. But I'm not sure that fear in this passage is the main problem. We're going to talk about fear today. We're going to talk about faith. But I don't think fear is really the main problem, because I think these guys had a reason to be fearful. And then there's a conclusion. There's shock, there's fear, and then there's a conclusion that they come to, that at least one of them comes to, who goes to wake Jesus up, comes to this conclusion. When he says to him, hey, don't you care that we're going to drown? And so the conclusion, when they hit that storm, they went on this journey with Jesus across the lake, and then they hit this very difficult storm, and their conclusion in the midst of the storm is, hey, you don't care. You don't care, Jesus. You don't care. You're asleep at the wheel. Surely you've forgotten about me. A lot of people feel that way in life when they hit a storm in their life, and they set out on this journey of faith, and they think, oh, things are going to be great, and then they hit this storm in life. One of the conclusions that many people come to is, well, God, you obviously aren't paying attention. You're not watching out for me. You don't care. You've forgotten about me. And maybe you felt that way too. Maybe you felt that way many times. And that's what we find here in this passage. But let me draw you back to verse 35. Let me draw your attention back there. In verse 35, it says this: Jesus said to them, let us go over to the other side. Let's go over to the other side. Jesus is the one who invited them, and Jesus is the one that says, we are going over to the other side. So if Jesus says to you, you're going over to the other side, you're not going under. If Jesus says to them, they're going over, as bad as it looks at this moment, they're not going under. See, he made a promise to them at the very beginning. We are going over to the other side. And then in verse 39, after they confront him and wake him up and say to him, hey, you don't care, or you're going to let us drown, this is what happens. He got up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, quiet, be still. Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. Jesus calms the wind and the waves. See, Jesus in that moment reminds them that the God who calms the wind and the waves, he's in their boat. And the God who calms the wind and the waves, he's in your boat. He's in your boat. If you in faith have asked him into your life, he is in your boat. So this passage is filled with a lot of things. There's fear, there's confusion. We haven't even got to our question yet that God asks us. But I want to show you this video that kind of captures why we don't have to be afraid, because the God who is the God of the wind and the waves, the God who calms the wind and the waves, and the God who rose from the dead is in our boat. And as we begin this first part of this message, I want us to have that as our foundation, to remember that God is in our boat, that he is with us, and that the one who is risen, the one who has overcome, says to us, you're not going under, you're going over. You're going to make it to where you're going. You're not going under, because he is risen, he is alive. He takes us through the storm. So watch this, and he takes us through our fears. So check this out.
I'm afraid of not knowing my purpose.
I am afraid of being inadequate to face life's challenges.
I'm afraid of storms.
I'm afraid of not being the best teacher that I can be.
Especially since my husband has died, I've had a fear of loneliness and insecurity.
I'm afraid of the darkness.
I'm afraid of missed opportunities.
I am afraid that I will never be good enough.
I'm afraid of losing those that are close to me. I'm afraid of not being enough.
I used to be afraid of failure.
I was afraid of losing a loved one.
I was afraid of being a sufficient godly mom.
I was afraid of telling people no.
I was afraid of being anxious.
I was afraid of failure.
I was afraid of being unknown.
I was afraid of being lonely.
I was afraid of inadequacy.
I was afraid of death.
I was afraid of not being good enough.
Jesus has conquered my fear of being alone because he shows me that he's always with me.
I no longer fear being inadequate because Jesus has shown me that he is more than enough.
I'm no longer afraid of not being good enough because I am his workmanship.
Jesus conquered the fear of being unknown in my life by reminding me I am a child of God and I was fearfully and wonderfully made.
I was afraid of insignificance, but Jesus gave me purpose.
Jesus conquered my fear by walking ahead of me and giving me new mercies every day.
Jesus has taught me that my identity is in him and he is more than enough.
I no longer fear death because Jesus is risen.
Psalm 27:1 says it this way. It says, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" You know, the story goes of a plane trip, that this plane trip was filled with turbulence. I don't know if you've ever been on a trip like that, but this trip was filled with turbulence. Passengers are nervous. They're getting jolted around back and forth. But there is this little girl sitting silently, sitting peacefully, reading a book, calmly by herself. And she's just sitting there, and people notice this, and the other passengers notice that she's just sitting there calmly while everybody else is kind of in a little bit of a panic and nervous. And so they asked her, they say, "How are you so calm in this moment?" And she says these words. She says, "My daddy is the pilot, and he is taking me home." So fear can be a really controlling thing in our life unless we realize who is in our boat. But that brings us to our question for today. This brings us to the question that we want to look at this week for our series. And so we go back a little bit to Mark 4:39. It says, "He got up," that's Jesus, "rebuked the wind and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.' Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. And he said to his disciples," so here comes the question, "Why are you so afraid?" Why are you so afraid? Why are you so afraid? And then the question that sneaks in right behind it is this: do you still have no faith? Do you still have no faith? Why are you so afraid? And do you still have no faith? See, Jesus in this moment links those two things together, fear and faith. And he links those things together and he says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" So it's important for us today to ask the question back is that what is true faith? What does true faith look like? Well, what does that look like? What is true faith? Well, there's a lot of things you could say, and the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, gives us a kind of direct look at what faith is. Now, I will tell you right up front that this verse has never been that helpful to me when I've ever looked at trying to define my own faith if you read the verse just all by itself. And this is what it says in Hebrews chapter 11. The writer writes, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. So the writer says that faith here is confidence in what we hope for, but people could hope for a lot of different things. So you can define this however you want if you just read one verse. It's like confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. And so there's a lot of wiggle room in there, but if you read the rest of the chapter, the author goes on and he explains how these people lived in faith, these great examples of faith, people who suffered for their faith, people who lived with this outstanding faith, and their faith was in the living God. It wasn't just in what they thought, or it wasn't, their confidence wasn't just in what they believed they should have faith in, but it was in God and His promises. That was their faith. Their faith had a good object. It was in God and His promises. See, I think the Message version captures this a little better for us. It says, the fundamental fact of existence is that this trust in God, there's that word trust again, this trust in God, this faith is the firm foundation under everything that makes life worth living. It's our handle on what we can't see. So that to me is more helpful, at least for me, but you see that word trust there. Trust. And when we talk about faith, that's what we're really ultimately talking about, is we're talking about trust and where your trust is. So faith, let me give you a definition of faith that I think is a great working definition. Faith is trust in the person, the promises, and the character of God. Did you catch that? Trust in the person, the promises, and the character of God. Isaiah chapter 41, verse 10 says, "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." And so we see the character of God there. We see the promises of God. And we see the person of God right there in the midst of our lives. And see, real life is the process where all of this happens. It's where true faith is forged. It's forged in the storms. It's forged in the everyday. It's formed in each day of your life. It's formed in real life. That's where trust is built in God. But there's a couple of things that faith isn't either. And I think that helps us kind of see what faith is by looking at what it isn't, because so many people are confused about this. But in Mark chapter 4, let's go back to our story. In verse 41, it says, after Jesus says, why do you have no faith? It says this in verse 41, they were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." See, they're terrified in that moment. And I love what it says. They turn to each other and go, "Who is this?" You know, they're kind of freaked out that the wind and the waves obey him. So I want to show you a couple things from this passage that, you know, faith isn't. First of all, faith isn't just intellectual assent. It's not just believing there's a God. It's not just believing facts about God. That's not faith. That's not trust in God. It's also not just amazement. Did you notice here that they're amazed? They're like, "Who is this?" But that doesn't mean they have faith. They're still terrified. They're still terrified. It doesn't mean that they trust this person. Like, there were people that followed Jesus around who were just in amazement of him, but it didn't mean that they trusted him. There's lots of fans of Jesus, but few followers. Now, this little phrase here, they were terrified. I think there's something really cool for us here to grasp onto, because I think that these are actually the first steps of faith. that these men in this moment, these disciples, are experiencing the first moments of faith, these first steps of faith. See, what if fear in trusting Jesus, to hand your whole life over to Jesus is a fearful thing? Like, who is this man? Is he worthy of my trust? It's trusting Jesus with your life is a fearful thing, to take that step of faith. And they were terrified at this moment. But what if trusting Jesus removes the fear of everything else? What if it removes the fear of everything else? What if we fear God and that helps us to not fear anything else? John Donne might be one of the most famous writers, poets, preachers that you might have never heard of. You've heard some of his phrases used, like people say the phrase, "No man is an island." That came from John Donne. Or, "For whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." Those are words from John Donne. And John Doe would be funny, but John Donne. John Donne wrote a famous work called Devotions in the year 1623, and he wrote it in London during a pandemic. And it was the bubonic plague. And he wrote it even further than that. He wrote when he was deathly sick from his deathbed. He wrote these words from his deathbed, or so he thought. He thought this was the end of his life. John Donne penned this phrase, "Give me, O Lord, a fear of which I may not be afraid." Give me, O Lord, a fear of which I may not be afraid. Philip Yancey, the great writer in our time, recently did a paraphrase or a modern retelling of John Donne's words. And he writes in his book, he writes this: "Life will always include circumstances that invite fear, that incite fear. If not illness, financial hardship, if not poverty, rejection, if not loneliness, failure. In such a world, Donne has a choice to fear God or to fear everything else." Do you get that? Do you get that? Our faith, which is the thing, is the antidote to fear. Faith is what keeps our life from being fearful. But we fear God. We fear God, and because we fear God and we have faith in Him, we don't have to fear everything else. We don't have to fear everything else. In fact, the book of Proverbs, right, tells us that the beginning of all wisdom is the fear of the Lord. So it's really like choose your fear in some ways. See, true faith is the trust in God in the midst of fear, but fearing the right thing. Fearing God. Fearing God, the one who is the maker and creator of all things. And that's a little terrifying. It's a little terrifying to place your hands in the hands of, or to place your life in the hands of God. But the alternative is to fear everything else. I have been really enjoying the spiritual journey that I'm watching a guy named Jordan Peterson be on. Maybe you've heard of Jordan Peterson. He's a world-renowned psychologist, psychotherapist, writer. He wrote the 12 Rules of Life, New York Times bestseller. He's written a few books. And I've been watching over the last 4 or 5 years his journey of faith from atheism to where I believe he's really come to a faith in Christ. And this journey, I want to show you, somebody put together this kind of video, and I'm just going to show you a small portion of it where he talks about this journey, and you'll see it kind of played out in his own life. And these videos go over a number of years and little snippets put together. But I want you to see how he talks about the terrifying thing about what it would look like to put your life into the hands of God. And if you truly believe that, if you truly trusted that, how terrifying, but how amazing that could be. So I want you to watch this. The words can get a little heady, but I think you'll enjoy this as you watch one man struggle with trusting God. So watch this.
I'm not an atheist anymore because I don't look at the world that way anymore. I'm not a materialist anymore. I don't think the world's made out of matter. I think it's made out of what matters. It's made out of meaning. What we orient towards unconsciously, which means what captures our attention, is meaning, and it captures our attention before we know what it is. The brain acts as if the world's made out of information or made out of meaning.
Who would have the audacity to claim that they believed in God if they examined the way they lived? Who would dare say that? To believe, you think, to believe in a Christian sense, to actually, this is why Nietzsche said there was only ever one Christian, and that was Christ. To have the audacity to claim that means that you live it out fully. And that's an unbearable task in some sense. To be able to accept the structure of existence, the suffering that goes along with it, and the disappointment and the betrayal, and to nonetheless act properly, right? To aim at the good with all your heart, right? To dispense with the malevolence and your desire for destruction and revenge and all of that, and to face things courageously and to tell the truth, to speak the truth and to act it out. That's what it means to believe. That's what it means. It doesn't mean to state it. It means to act it out. And unless you act it out, you should be very careful about claiming it. And so I've never been comfortable saying anything other than I try to act as if God exists, because God only knows what you'd be if you truly believed. I mean, if you think about it in some sense, that's the central idea in Christianity, is that if you were capable of believing, it would be a transfiguring event, a truly transfiguring event. And I know people experience that to one degree or another, but we have no idea what the limit of that is. And we have no idea what the possibility is within each person if they lived a life that was maximally courageous and maximally truthful. You know, because maybe you're running at 60% or 70% or 20% and at cross purposes to yourself. God only knows what you'd be if you believed. And so, while I try to act like I believe, but I'd never claim that I manage it. So you can think about Christ from a psychological perspective, and the critic, my critic, this particular critic that I've been reading, said, well, that doesn't differentiate Christ much from a whole sequence of dying and resurrecting mythological gods. And of course, people have made that claim in comparative religion. Joseph Campbell did that, and Jung to a lesser degree, I would say, but Campbell did that. But the difference, and C.S. Lewis pointed this out as well, the difference between those mythological gods and Christ was that there's a representation of, there's a historical representation of his existence as well. Now, you can debate whether or not that's genuine. You can debate about whether or not he actually lived and whether there's credible objective evidence for that, but it doesn't matter in some sense because it does, but there's a sense in which it doesn't matter because there's still a historical story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it. Like, because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. You know, that's Jungian synchronicity. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. You know, we have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. Like, we treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know what to... that seems to me oddly plausible. But I still don't know what to make of it. It's partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
Wow. What a great question by Jordan Peterson. What would you be? What would you be if you fully believed? It's a great question. Great question. Well, obviously, we've changed locations again. I mean, we're on the move for this message. We are moving. Hey, we're talking about faith, and Jesus is talking about going over the other side, and he's moving and grooving, and we got to keep moving too. And I'm now back in my home office here. I want to wrap this message up for you today and to finish this out. So we talked about out of Jordan Peterson, we talked about, you know, like what is real faith? I think to close, we have to also look at the question is, what good is faith? So we went through all of this. Jesus is teaching us lessons from the boat, but I think it's great in our modern world to ask the question, what good is faith? Like what good is it? People ask me that all the time. Why do I really need faith? Or people are asking that in our culture all the time. Why do I have to have faith? What good is it? If I have Google, why do I need God? If I can find out everything I need from Google, why do I need God at all? Well, there's a lot of answers I could give to this, but I want to give you two today to kind of wrap this up. The first one is this, is that what good is faith? Well, I think faith deals with something, a couple things. It deals with many things, to be honest with you, but it deals with two things that I don't believe that we have any defense against as human beings. That we were never meant to deal with these things, so when they come into this broken world, we have no defenses in here against them. Our heart has no defenses. And those two things, and I could say this being a pastor for 31 years, I've seen so many people's lives who are run by these two things. And we have no defenses against them on our own. And those two things are fear and guilt. Now, last week we talked about in the story with Isaiah, one of the first things that God dealt with Isaiah was his guilt. And that's all throughout Scripture. And so is fear. God dealing with fear. Verses like perfect love drives out all fear, or that that we are called to fear not over and over and over again. God is challenging our fear. And our defense is we have nothing in ourselves, and we will try to deal with our fear and our guilt with all different outside things in order to fix what's in here. And so fear and guilt, faith, trusting in God, deals with those two things, with fear and guilt. I wish I had more time to go into that, but I don't. But I think you'll find that true in your life. And we talked about the fear one a lot tonight, but also it deals with our guilt. Jesus' death on the cross is his sacrifice, his perfect sacrifice for our sins. And the second thing that I think is what good is faith is this, that everything else is lacking. Everything else is lacking, but faith gives us a firm foundation to build on. I came across this quote this week. I want to read it to you. Is the author who is writing about atheism, and that is a growing number of people who have no faith in God in our culture, no trust in God, don't see the reason for God. They are basically atheists, practical atheists, or at best agnostics. But this is what he writes. He says, Thus, atheism requires belief, including faith in, that's trust, right? Atheism does actually require belief and trust in, choose one, the perfectibility of human nature, the omniscience of science, the equality of socialism, or the steady conquest of political, technological, and social progress. But reasoned observation shows that the truths produced by these philosophies and systems of thought are lacking and incomplete. They cannot provide a satisfactory answer to the big questions about life, reality, and existence. That was Carl Olson. Those are just a couple reasons I want to give you. What good is faith? It deals with our fear and our guilt. And 2, everything else is lacking. I found that to be true in my own life, that everything else other than Jesus was lacking. So to close this out, Jesus' questions to us this week were, why are you so afraid? Are you afraid? Is fear running your life? Are you making decisions on fear? Do you fear God at all? Because I think if you feared God a little bit, if you feared God and you trusted Him with your life, you wouldn't fear anything else, including death itself. And why do you still have no faith? That's what Jesus asked His disciples. Why do you still have no faith? Maybe it's time to put your trust in the one who is worthy of that trust. His character, His promises, and His person. To put your trust in that. That's my prayer for you. I pray this message has been some hope to your soul today, wherever you're watching this. Thanks for joining me as I've jumped around to different places today, and come back for next week as we continue in our series. God bless you, and I hope that you have a wonderful week with your family and your friends. And I hope it's a week of trusting in God, the one who loves you, who cares for you, and who gave His life for you. Amen. Have a good one.